On September 23, 2011, a man was found hanging from a tree at a small Kentucky cemetery. His hands were bound behind his back. A rope was wrapped tightly around his neck. A gag was tied across his mouth, and pinned to his chest was a handwritten sign. At first glance, it looked like a lynching. Then it looked like a murder. Then officials said something that stunned almost everyone who heard it. They ruled it a suicide. This is the death of Bill Sparkman, and why that explanation still doesn't sit right. Bill Sparkman was a 51-year-old census worker living in Clay County, Kentucky. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't politically powerful. He wasn't involved in any known criminal activity. But his job mattered. As a U.S. Census worker, Sparkman was responsible for going door to door, collecting information that directly affected federal funding, political representation, and local resources. And in rural communities, that work was not always welcomed. Friends described him as quiet and private. He lived alone, kept to himself, and had few close relationships. But there was nothing in his history that suggested self-harm. That's what made what happened next so disturbing. Sparkman was reported missing after failing to return home from his census route. Later that day, he was found in the Daniel Boone National Forest, hanging from a tree inside a small cemetery. The scene was immediately alarming. His ankles were bound. His wrists were tied behind his back. A rope was looped around his neck and attached to the tree. A gag was placed in his mouth. And on his chest, written in black marker on duct tape, was a message: "Fed." The implication was obvious. Someone wanted this to look like a message, not just a death. Local authorities initially treated the scene as a homicide. Then, within days, the narrative changed. Despite the bindings, the gag, and the sign, investigators concluded that Bill Sparkman had taken his own life. The explanation was that Sparkman staged the scene himself, tying his own hands and ankles, gagging himself, hanging himself, and pinning the sign to his chest. Officials suggested he may have done this to draw attention or make a statement. But there was a problem. They could not demonstrate how he physically accomplished this. No clear explanation was given for how Sparkman restrained himself so completely without assistance, or how he positioned the rope in a way that would allow suspension after binding his own limbs. Even more troubling, there was no suicide note, and no prior indication that Sparkman was suicidal. Independent forensic experts quickly raised concerns. First, the bindings. Tying your hands behind your back is already difficult. Doing it tightly enough to prevent escape is even harder. Adding bound ankles and a gag complicates it further. Second, the sign. The placement of the message required dexterity and visibility, both severely limited once restrained. Third, the location. Sparkman's body was found in a remote cemetery, deep within forested land. There was no clear evidence he had been to that location before, and no witnesses placing him there voluntarily. Fourth, the motive. If this was a suicide, what was the intent? The sign seemed political, the method seemed theatrical. But Sparkman had no known history of extremist beliefs, protest behavior, or public statements against the government. The staging didn't match the man. Because Sparkman was a federal employee, the FBI became involved. After reviewing the case, the FBI supported the suicide ruling. But critics noted something important. The FBI relied heavily on the same conclusions drawn by local investigators. There was no public demonstration of alternative reconstructions, no reenactment, no detailed explanation of the mechanics. To many observers, the ruling felt less like a conclusion and more like a decision. And once that decision was made, the case went quiet. No suspects, no charges, no further investigation. Many people were upset by this outcome. They believed the conclusion was obvious, that this was a homicide. Despite their efforts, the police would not budge. They stuck to the final ruling and allowed whoever did this, if anyone did, to walk freely. Years later, Bill Sparkman's death is still debated. Some believe he was targeted because of his job. Others believe the scene was staged to send a message. Some accept the suicide ruling, but admit it's deeply uncomfortable. What makes the case linger isn't just the strangeness of the scene. It's the speed at which the explanation settled. There were too many unanswered questions, too many physical contradictions, too little transparency. And once the case was labeled solved, interest faded, except among those who couldn't reconcile the facts. Bill Sparkman went to work one morning and never came home. He was found bound, gagged, hanging from a tree, labeled as something he may or may not have believed. The official record says he did this to himself, but the evidence leaves room for doubt. And in cases like this, doubt matters. Because when a death looks like a warning, feels like a message, and defies simple explanation, the most dangerous thing isn't asking questions. It's stopping. Bill Sparkman was a man beloved by many people in his community. He was a normal man who just wanted to do his job and stay alive. Was he murdered, or did he actually hang himself? Evidence is stacked up to be heavily one-sided. If the case was to reopen, would there have been a different outcome? There are so many questions to ask when it comes to this case. However, it will always remain unsolved.